Hello everyone. Our topic this week was requested by Skylar. We'll be going over the story of Kog'Maw and Malzahar from the League of Legends franchise. Spoilers for a MOBA, I guess?
Okay, so the lore request was for Kog'Maw, but his very limited story is tied directly into the story of another character named Malzahar, whose story is tied into the Void. So we're going to start by explaining the Void, then talk about Malzahar, and finally end with Kog'Maw. Most of the events in League of Legends, hereafter referred to as LoL, take place on a world called Runeterra. It is a world of myth and magic that touches or overlaps and flirts with other dimensions and realities on the regular. While magic is a native aspect of Runeterran reality, numerous people, creatures, and factions also draw power from other realms, both malevolent and benevolent. One of these realms is simply called the Void. The Void is a realm of nothingness. There is no time in the Void, no light, no darkness, no warmth, no cold, just empty, purple, Cthulian nothing. Or at least that's how the Void is perceived and described, even by mortals who've glimpsed it and the beings that were born from it. But for a realm to roil, there has to be both something causing the motion and something to be moved. What's more, the consciousness is born deep in the Void, though apparently unaware of their own existence until they felt the presence of reality on Runeterra, did in fact already exist. Even though these beings had no concept of their own existence, of shape or form, they did have will and sapience and power.
The most powerful known creatures from the Void are called the Watchers, beings of vast power and cunning whose only known goal is to consume Runeterra and all of the rest of reality. Void energies, portals, and some Void creatures convert matter and magic into Void stuff, and it is theoretically through this assimilation of reality that the Watchers plan to break down all of existence into the empty nothing of the, for them, more familiar Void. For all of their power, though, the Watchers are nowhere close to all-knowing. In the distant, likely millennia past, many of them manifested physically in the world, only to be shocked and disoriented by the full scope of what it meant to exist in reality. They took on corporeal form for the first time, experienced physical sensations like cold, heat, hunger, thirst for the first time. They experienced comfort and pain, and perhaps most jarringly, time. This particular set of Watchers was defeated and magically imprisoned, but while they could no longer unleash their full power from within their containment, and possibly by nature of the limitations of being real in a way they never had been before, either the trapped Watchers, those Watchers who watched in shock and dismay from within the safety of the Void, or both, came up with a myriad of new plans. The most basic and generally useful of which was the creation of Voidborn, beings formed by the Watchers' will, but generally of real matter touched by the Void. Each summoned into the world is unique, and most have the purpose of learning in some twisted way about reality and feeding that information back to the Watchers. Kog'Maw is one of these Voidborn. It's worth noting that so much about the Void itself is intentionally written to be unknowable that it's possible that the Watchers aren't the end-all be-all of the Void's masters, but they are the known Void bigwigs and are generally accepted as the direct masters of all Voidborn. Though not all Voidborn have a direct line of communication with the Watchers, as many of them are essentially given drives and directives and then set loose upon the world to fulfill them.
So, the Watchers and, more generally, the forces of the Void have spent millennia trying to slowly gobble up reality, with Voidborn and the occasional work of Runeterrans ripping open great portals to the Void from which Void stuff encroaches, devouring everything, specifically organic matter and magic, as it has been noted that the Void can apparently be starved and thus stayed without access to one or the other to consume. A fact which makes the story of Malzahar and Kog'Maw particularly interesting. In ages past before the birth of Malzahar, who was born a human, there was a desert city that was conquered by LoL's ancient Egyptian empire analog. After 1,000 years of enslavement, the city rose up and rebelled, prompting the empire to drop an army, complete with ridiculous numbers of mages and demigod warriors, onto the rebellious city. In response, the city powered up a magical device they'd previously discovered that ripped open a great hole into the Void. The Empire's army was swallowed up, several demigods included, but so too was the city, with only a handful of survivors from either side making it out to tell the tale. The Empire was then forced to spend years fighting the encroaching Void before it was finally pushed back enough to be considered handled and starved. The Empire eventually moved on, and the tales of the desert city and the source of the Void's encroachment fell into myth and legend. The area itself lost to the desert.
Much later, in a desert city far away from there, Malzahar would be born to poor parents who died while he was still young thanks to a wasting disease, leaving the young Malzahar to fend for himself on the streets. His tale of gutter survival is different than most, though, because Malzahar was born with the power to glimpse the future, a power that, again, unusually in fiction, he had reliable control over from an early age, rather than it being a deus ex machina, I can only see when and what the plot wants me to see kind of ability. Indeed, the only future it is ever noted that Malzahar struggled to see was his own. For everyone else, their futures were an open book. So, as the years passed, Malzahar made his living as an increasingly successful and sought-after fortune teller, rising from a dirty back alley child sharing visions for scraps of bread to a wealthy man who nobles and merchants traveled miles and paid fortunes to meet. While for most people, these changes in circumstances would lead to a life of happiness and prosperity at the best, and indolence and excess at the worst, Malzahar's life again took an unusual path, one ultimately unfortunate for the world at large. Malzahar watched his parents die, slowly, when he was very young, possibly of a sickness that would have been curable had they been wealthy. He then lived on the streets as essentially a powerful beggar for many years. Even as his circumstances improved, he found that money didn't solve all problems and that people of different classes didn't change. The fat, rich merchants who showered Malzahar on riches were just as likely to be callous and self-serving as the emaciated gutter trash who'd as soon stab you for the meal in your hands as carry on a conversation with you. What's more, after watching so many lives unfold, he kept seeing people fall into the same cycles of misery and confusion over and over again. The most frustrating part of all of this was that Malzahar couldn't help but notice that so much of the suffering and trouble and challenges that everyone went through was self-inflicted. So many of our problems come from things we do to ourselves.
Years passed and Malzahar grew more and more empty inside. Finally, he simply up and left, leaving everything he'd earned and the life he'd made behind. For years, he wandered his desert homeland. His findings only reinforced the conclusions he'd already made, that life was suffering and that all people could possibly do, in the long run, was make it worse. As he became more and more morose about these conclusions, he began having new, feverish dreams, visions that distracted and eventually plagued even his waking moments, making it hard to focus. He heard whispers of wars and strife, accompanied by visions of endless suffering and horror. Further and further into the desert he wandered, mind blistered by the haunting specters of seemingly immutable futures, until, unbeknownst to him, he came to that ancient city where so long ago rebels had summoned the void itself into their country. There, gazing into a deep abyss once rent open by the hungry void, his mind feverish and near broken, Malzahar opened himself, extending his senses, searching for understanding. And there, in the forgotten corner of the desert, where it once erupted violently forward, the void answered his call.
For most, the touch of the void induces madness or outright kills and even unwrites the very fabric of a person's being. For Malzahar, perhaps he was already too broken, or perhaps he was simply pushed over that final edge into madness. But whatever the details of his experience, Malzahar emerged from that congress with the void a new, well, no longer a man, but a new person. For the first time in his life, he had a purpose. Malzahar realized that, contrary to his long-held belief, he had always been able to see his own future. That when he looked forward and saw nothing, it wasn't a failure of his power to perceive coming events, but rather he was being shown that the nothingness that the void would bring was itself his destiny. His skull translucent and pulsing with the literal power of the void, Malzahar left the ruins of that ancient city and declared himself the prophet of the void. He would usher the void into this world, and the people of this world into the void, because in the sweet nothingness of the void, there was peace. When all was consumed by oblivion, there would be no pain, no inequality, no suffering, no injustice. All would be at peace. In the years since, Malzahar has gained and spent numerous cult followings. Some he pulls to his side with sheer charisma, convincing them of his nihilistic view of the goodness of the void. Others he uses his newfound powers to brainwash into acceptance, and still others he simply feeds to the void, summoning minor voidborn to do his bidding. As time passed, whispers of the prophet have spread far outside his own lands, with cults existing in small numbers all over. His own faithful cast themselves, their enemies, and their livestock into void fissures that Malzahar opens with his own hands, while the superstitious but unconvinced offer up livestock in the hopes that the void and Malzahar's cultists will be appeased.
Somewhere in the midst of all of this, Kog'Maw was born. Some, if not all, of the fever dreams, visions, and whispers that plagued Malzahar and slowly led him toward the ancient city where he finally found a purpose, came from a void being, possibly a watcher, though not necessarily, Whatever this void creature was, it anchored itself to Malzahar's psyche. It's even possible that the void mass that now serves as most of what can be seen of Malzahar's head is in fact this creature's physical form. It is this creature that grants Malzahar much of his void powers, and which pushes him to continue acting as the Prophet of the Void. Some might argue that it itself is in fact the very drive that Malzahar now feels, but most of that is speculation. What is fact is that while it once lured Malzahar to the ancient city, now, nestled in Malzahar's being, it calls for another, Kog'Maw. Kog'Maw is Voidborn. From within the depths of the void, it heard, saw, or felt the gentle call of this being in Malzahar's mind. Like a flickering candle at the end of a dark hallway, small, unobtrusive, but unmistakable. This pull drew Kog'Maw to take his first steps onto Runeterran soil, through a fissure found in the very same city where Malzahar decided to become the Void's prophet. Uniquely among the named playable Voidborn, Kog'Maw is not characterized as being wholly malicious, evil, or cruel. He is simply characterized as curious and hungry, seemingly working on bestial levels of intelligence, or alternatively with the reasoning of a young, still developing child. Like most Voidborn, Kog'Maw's senses were initially overwhelmed by the wash of new sensations available to him in this corporeal body. He was enchanted by the colors and aromas of the world, even someplace as comparatively sterile as the desert. Like a newborn, Kog'Maw found that the best way for him to understand a thing was to eat it. In the case of this particular Voidborn, Kog'Maw's stomach acid is so powerful that it effectively disintegrates almost anything in a matter of seconds, such that he can consume several times his own mass very quickly without ever finding his hunger or curiosity satiated. His fearful ability to consume everything in his path has earned him the title the Mouth of the Abyss. And his almost innocent naivete means that he simply wanders around eating whatever seems interesting, whether it's a building, an animal, a person, or the sword they tried to kill him with the same sort of fearless, youthful curiosity of a young cub, slowly following the quiet, gentle tug from the being that has mounted itself to Malzahar. What will happen if and when the two finally meet is entirely unknown, but it will surely be a sight to see.
And that's basically the story of Kog'Maw and Malzahar. We hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave us a like and share it with someone you know might like it. If you have ideas for videos you'd like to see in the future, do like Skylar and let us know in the comments down below. If you'd like to see more videos, hit that subscribe button, and if you'd like to see our Let's Plays, follow the link in the description and subscribe to our Let's Play channel.
In the meantime, this has been
True Masters and Morons, signing off.